evidence and arguments about the Turin Shroud. Well, we've had 3 days of new arguments and new evidence, so I hope we do.
Exactly.
So take it away.
Thank you, Russ. So yeah, do we really need new evidence and arguments about the Turin Shroud? Yes, I think it's a good question. I mean, at the end of this conference, because we have a lot of evidence and arguments that were proposed here, and for example, just a brief history of the arguments for and against authenticity that were produced since the 14th century. But the history of modern arguments for or against the authenticity goes back to the beginning of the 20th century. The very first modern argument given against the authenticity of the Turin Shroud is a simple one. It was made by Ulysse Chevalier, the famous French historian. He was a medievalist. And of course, it was based on the Pierre d'Arcy Memorandum. But at the very same time, more complex arguments in favor of the authenticity were produced. Yves Delage, professor of zoology and biology, and his assistant, Paul Vignon, think after months of research that they can explain the image formation process. The Turin Shroud, according to them, is not a medieval piece of fabric, and it is indeed the burial cloth of Jesus. In 1902, Paul Vignon publishes his scientific study of the Turin Shroud, and a controversy immediately appears between Vignon and Delage on one side, and on the other side, Maurice Verne, a very famous professor of history of religion, and the chemist Marcelin Berthelot, also very famous. 8 years after the photograph taken by Giuseppe Henriet in 1931, Paul Vignon publishes a new book on the topic in which he tries to build a global case in favor of the authenticity. And of course, you know that more than 40 years later, after Vignon's book, the scientific studies led by the STURP point to the conclusion that the image was not the product of a medieval artist. This conclusion, given in a press release, which even describes the image formation process as an ongoing mystery, was much more an educated and unavoidable guess than a strict reasoning in an analytical process. However, the STURP assertions were seriously challenged by the 1988 radiocarbon dating. And the results of the 1988 dating reversed the trend, and proponents of antique linen cloth were classified as a fringe group. But much more interesting, since the 2000s, the trend has reversed again. The validity of the 1988 test is increasingly contested in peer-reviewed journals of history, statistics, and chemistry. Just to show you an analysis, a census of all articles on the Turin Shroud published in English and in French on the Turin Shroud between 2000 and 2015. So you can see immediately that between 2000 and 2015, approximately 29 articles were published. 29 articles conducted analysis and contained elements that reinforce the authenticity, whereas 5 provided analyses and contains elements that reinforce the medieval hypothesis, and 12 remained more or less neutral. Of course, this census cannot put an end to the controversy. Why? Because it's simple. This census is just subjective and arbitrary. It does not take into consideration the impact factors of the journal. It does not make a difference between seminal contribution and low-cited articles, and between research articles and review articles. It does not take into account the vast majority of peer-reviewed books in archaeology and chemistry, which are still, a vast majority of them are still in favor of the medieval origin, of course. But this census is really useful because it is a clear indication that there are some new variables, some new viable elements and arguments in favor of the antique origin. So the discussion has been reopened, we can say that, with a good level of certainty in mainstream science. And maybe a further indication, very significant one, is this one. It was published in May this year by Philip Ball, former Nature editor, in Nature Materials, about a paper which was published by Marcia Boy in Archaeometry. We have talked about that. And look at the title of the paper. Is this holy relic preserved? What an extraordinary title in a Nature group journal. Let's see what Philip Ball says. As a material artifact, the Shroud of Turin should be a fairly simple puzzle to solve. A disproof should be straightforward. The latest findings are presently soberly enough, but their reception will surely be considered by true believers to add weight to the case. Let the arguments begin. So, some systematic arguments were already produced. For example, just after the famous radiocarbon dating, a French mathematician and epistemologist, Arnaud Upensky, produced an epistemological table, but his conclusion was, of course, that the Turin Shroud was authentic, but Upensky included in this epistemological table many controversial facts. You have also, for example, a judicial trial which was attempted, but you know there is a big difference between a juridical truth and an historical truth, of course, and probabilistic approach made by, for example, by Bruno Barberis in 1997 or by Giulio Fanti. But you know, I think that this kind of probabilistic approach is really deficient because it can only show that the image was made by, that if the image was made by a forger or an artist, then the forger artist wanted to reproduce Jesus' crucifixion. So I guess it's not very significant. Over the last few years, two new systematic approaches were produced. One, by, which is called a minimal facts approach in favor of the resurrection hypothesis, and the other one with an opposite conclusion, an argument diagram in favor of the medieval forgery last year by Professor Douglas Walton. And let's have a look first at the minimal facts approach. It is based on a book that was published in 2010 by Mike Licona about the resurrection of Jesus, a new historiographical approach. And traditional historiographical criteria are applied to uncontroversial facts. And what are these criteria? By a decreasing order of importance. Plausibility, that means, does our knowledge in other fields reinforce the hypothesis? Explanatory scope, can the hypothesis do justice to all the facts? Explanatory power, is the hypothesis specific or accurate? Less ad hoc, and then in this less ad hoc you have the famous Occam razor. But as you can see, the Occam razor is the most popular criterion, but it's not the most important. And does the hypothesis rely on unverified data? And illumination, does the hypothesis shed light on other widely accepted phenomena? So, I decided to test this criteria on the medieval, on Galaskelly one, the best medieval hypothesis, I think. I'm not the only one. The natural hypothesis, that is the real body of Jesus, but without any supernatural intervention, and of course the resurrection hypothesis. So when I say minimal facts approach, it means that this methodology does not even take into account the real presence of blood or the presence of a real human being wrapped in the Turin Shroud. And of course it excludes the C14 results because now, as I have shown you, the results are really controversial. So, of course, the medieval Galaskelly hypothesis is very weak because it has, as we have, some speakers have already said, it has a low plausibility, no comparable example in the history of art. a low explanatory scope and explanatory power because the image was added after the so-called blood stain, not before. The superficially and 3D features were not even tested by Gardner-Kelly. It has a lack of simplicity. Yes, there is a rubbing technique on the human body. Then you have a face obtained from a bas-relief. Then you have prints of the finger that are painted. And you have also no illumination because it does not even explain the memorandum of Pierre Dacy, why Pierre Dacy, who was according was writing about the methodology used by the forger, does not even mention that to the Pope Clement VII, the use of a corpse of a naked body. I mean, it's a bad one. Natural hypothesis. Of a human body formed in such a way has ever been discovered. We have an explanatory scope which is not really sufficient because we have a real human body in the Turin Shroud. Oh, not so sure because in the minimal facts approach, we don't even know. Some measurements do not agree with normal anthropological standard, for example, the measurements of the hands, of the calves, or the torso. But we have a good explanatory power. The Maillard reaction and the corona effect are well known, for example, if we could take these two natural hypotheses in the scientific literature. But it's really ad hoc. For example, for the corona effect, you need really exceptional circumstances. An earthquake at the right time or at the right power. I mean, yeah. And we have a bad illumination because it does not explain, of course, the empty tomb. Oh. Where is the body after the corona effect? Resurrection hypothesis, the plausibility depends on your opinion. I mean, I argue in my paper in 2013 in the iTrop journal, I'm in favor of the plausibility of the resurrection, but I mean, it depends on your opinion. Explanatory scope, but deficient for the same reason as the natural hypothesis. We have a problem with a human body. And an insufficient explanatory power because we don't know exactly when the process leading to the creation of the image appeared. Was it, for example, a latent image or not? But it is less ad hoc than the medieval and the natural hypothesis. You need a single intervention of a single omnipotent agent, God. Of course, for God it's simple, I mean. There is a broad consensus in New Testament also, in New Testament scholarship, excuse me, that Jesus announced that he was an agent of God when he was alive, when he was doing his ministry. So there we have a good basis. It's not ad hoc, it's not contrived. And we have also a good illumination because the hypothesis is consistent with the anti-tomb, with the resurrection narrative, and with the first Christian creed, which appears in the first epistle to the Corinthians by Paul, first epistle, chapter 15. But I don't have time to go into the details. So here we are. I mean, single point of view, yes. Medieval hypothesis, but very weak. Resurrection hypothesis, yes, much better. Natural hypothesis, a little bit weak. A new analytical argument, as I was saying, by Douglas Walton, he used a heuristic technique. What is a heuristic technique? It's just, I'm gonna give to you Walton's definition. According to Walton, it's an inferential device that enables a person to rapidly jump to a tentative conclusion where a decision needs to be made in a situation of uncertainty. Oh. I mean, in 2 words, I mean, when the problem is too complex, you have to make a diagram to solve it. That's a heuristic technique. So Walton decided to use a diagram, and so he wrote a book just on that, on argument evaluation and evidence at Springer. I mean, a very good publication. He uses the example of the Turin Shroud controversy in order to show how to solve a controversial case. And his conclusion was clear and opposed to mine, of course. The Turin Shroud is a medieval forgery. Let's have a look at his diagram. Oh, not so simple. So, so you have to read it from right to left. Let me give you the explanation by Walton. The ultimate claim that is at issue in the dispute is represented in the text box at the far left of the diagram. You see, the cloth is the burial shroud of Jesus. The proposition in the text box states that the cloth is the burial shroud of Jesus. The argument displayed to the right of this text box all lead by sequences of arrows into the single proposition. The arguments are represented by the circles, and some information about the nature of the argument is contained by notation within each circle. And when you see X, it's for expert, when it's backed by expert opinion. But, of course, Walton's ambition is only to present a realistic enough case, despite its incompleteness, to give the reader some idea of how an argument diagram can be used, but he makes several mistakes, factual errors. For example, if you have a look at the left, you see when he is speaking about the 1988 datation, and you see a second team of scientific experts, etc., you see an independent confirmation, and we know that it was not an independent confirmation, and we know, for example, that it was not between 2060 and 1319 for each laboratory. So he is really deficient about that. And much more than that, he says if some evidence for the repair hypothesis were given, it could be a very strong counter-argument and might defeat the network of pro-arguments supporting the ultimate claim at issue. So, and we know, thanks to Raymond Rogers, thanks to Marco Riani, that we have some evidence for the repair hypothesis now. So, in fact, what do we have? We have an imperfect knowledge of the topic by Walton. We have an oversimplification admitted by him, and it leads to an erroneous conclusion. In fact, with an argument diagram, a convincing case in favor of the authenticity can also be made. Yeah, we can say that. So, all in all, we have a justified belief in authenticity. When I mean justified, I don't mean an ultimate proof or even a proof beyond reasonable doubt. I just want to say that it is justified. That is to say, we can have a good reason to believe that the Turin Shroud is authentic. So the Turin Shroud, if you have good reason, should be part of an argument for miracle. Yes, often an argument against miracle, it's a consequence of Hume, but it should be part of an argument for miracle. And I don't have time to read you the definition given by Robert Larmer in 2013, but it's an interdisciplinary argument. And what if in the near future, we have an overwhelming evidence in favor of authenticity? Just imagine this hypothesis. Just imagine that. What if this argument from miracles points to an overwhelming evidence for the resurrection hypothesis? Contrary to a commonly held opinion among believers and Shroud scholars, a hypothetical ultimate proof in favor of the resurrection hypothesis does not constitute a contradiction or a danger for the life of faith. This argument is not pertinent both on a theological level and on a much more practical level. Because on a practical level, we all know that scientific or historical certainties do not prevent someone from holding extravagant opinion. For example, you have Junger's theory, you have Chris Smith's theory, you have a substitution of Jesus before his crucifixion. You hear that all the time. Let's now examine the theological level. The essence of Christian faith is a free response to God's command, and not the certainty of its existence. I mean, just think of that. The devil is also sure of God's existence. That's what is explicitly said in the epistle of James. It is said, "You believe that there is one God? Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder." So, not only that, but we have all a possibility of free response in front of miraculous events. And it is really attested in the Gospel, for example. Let me give you a quote by Matthew, for example. "Then Jesus began to denounce the town in which most of his miracle or mighty works had been performed because they did not repent." And just think that of a thought experiment of the star forming the sentence, "God exists." Because we can also address this classical thought experiment. If the star were to form the sentence, "God exists," in the sky, would you still be an atheist or an agnostic? And let me quote Philip Ball again. This time it was not in Nature Material, but in his own blog, in his personal blog. So, it is hierarchy of explanation. It is a hoax or wild illusion. I have lost my mind. It is alien. It is the supreme being saying hello. I have no problem of principle with walking my way through that progression. Yes, I am open to persuasion that God exists. Let me say that if you are open that God exists after the existence of aliens, yeah, maybe you are not that open. Maybe you are too close to what we call methodological naturalism. And so, just to conclude, the potential overwhelming evidence in favor of the resurrection is not a danger for the life of faith. And to conclude, I mean, what have we seen? We have seen that we have a new trend in peer-reviewed articles, plus new analytical approaches, and that can lead to a strong case in favor of the Turin Shroud authenticity that can be made without further evidence. But we have in a heuristic approach, right, so in a quick approach, the 1988 radiocarbon dating still remains a straightforward disproof. We can see that all the time. We all need new evidence, tests, and arguments. But sometimes even valid arguments based on overwhelming evidence cannot convince everyone, especially on religious topics. So new evidence are crucial to show what a reasonable answer should be. And this is the reason why new evidence, tests, and arguments are needed. It is just, according to good invitation to provide new evidence and arguments. So, thank you for your attention. If you have questions,